What if the most influential thinker of modern times was not a system builder, but a soul awakener? What if the ideas that shaped entire disciplines, psychology, philosophy, education, even spirituality, began not with conclusions, but with courageous questions? This video is not a biography. It is an immersion, a guided passage into the legacy of William James, whose ideas did not remain trapped in academia, but spilled into the bloodstream of culture. If you have ever questioned the rigidity of truth, the limits of science, the role of belief, or the nature of the self, you are already under his influence. James did not seek followers. He cultivated thinkers. His legacy is not a monument. It is a movement, a set of mental and moral tools passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, transforming those brave enough to use them. From John Dewey to Carl Jung, from Bertrand Russell to Albert Einstein, from Viktor Frankl to Richard Rorty, James' fingerprints are everywhere. But more importantly, they are here, in the way you wonder, in the questions you dare to ask, in the reality you help shape by choosing. This video is for those who feel there's more to thought than conformity, more to life than description. If you're ready to trace the invisible lines that connect past insight to present action, stay with us, because this is not about understanding influence. It's about becoming part of it. It begins not with influence, but with interruption. William James did not enter the intellectual world to reinforce its structures. He came to shake them. And from the very start, his thinking bore the marks of rebellion against the mechanistic determinism of 19th century science, against the sterile abstractions of metaphysical philosophy, and against the soul-crushing rigidity of systems that pretended to know everything. In 1890, when the Principles of Psychology was published, it shattered the prevailing idea that the mind could be treated like a machine. James insisted that consciousness was not a thing, but a process, a stream, fluid and alive, irreducible to parts. This simple shift in metaphor, stream, not structure, would ripple through generations. It gave birth to modern psychology's emphasis on lived experience. It allowed Freud to explore the unconscious, Jung to explore archetypes, and Dewey to reform education itself around the actual processes of learning. James' vision of the self as dynamic and plural, not fixed or singular, laid the groundwork for existential psychology and later for humanistic thinkers like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. His insistence on freedom, on the moral weight of choice, would resonate in the work of Viktor Frankl, who would claim, after surviving the Holocaust, that man is not destroyed by suffering, he is destroyed by suffering without meaning. Truth James had already begun to uncover decades before, but James' influence did not remain psychological. It crossed into the heart of philosophy. His pragmatism, a view that truth is what works in experience, what proves itself in action, challenged the dominance of analytic logic and open space for American philosophy to speak again of value, meaning, and action. Thinkers like Richard Rorty and Hilary Putnam would later inherit this spirit, rejecting the obsession with precision in favor of usefulness, pluralism, and lived insight. Even outside academia, James' fingerprints appear in educational reform, social activism, religious tolerance. Anywhere people have dared to say, the truth is not fixed, the future is not finished, the self is not complete. William James is already there. And if you've made it this far, you're not just learning about his legacy, you're standing in it. Like, subscribe, and stay, because influence is not a fact. It's a fire. And we've only just begun to trace the sparks. To understand the reach of William James' legacy, one must step beyond academia and trace the silent reverberations of his thought into the lives of those he never met, but whose thinking bore his mark. It is not through citation that James moved minds. It is through transformation of method, of metaphysics, of meaning itself. Take John Dewey, for instance, not merely a disciple, but a co-architect of pragmatism. Dewey took James' insights and embedded them in the foundations of democratic education. If James taught that truth must be tested in experience, Dewey made education a space for that testing. Schools became laboratories of living. Thought became action. Ideas became tools for life. The passive memorization of facts gave way to inquiry, exploration, doing. Then there is Bertrand Russell, a thinker seemingly at odds with James' pluralism. And yet, Russell engaged James not as an adversary, but as a necessary counterweight. James gave permission to doubt systems, to prioritize psychological richness over analytic precision. Even Russell's eventual wrestling with the limits of logic echoes James' warning that truth must be more than clarity. It must be lived. In the psychological realm, James' shadow lengthens further. Carl Jung found in James' openness to the mystical a precedent for his exploration of the collective unconscious. James had already studied religious visionaries and madmen, saints and sufferers with a rare empathy. He did not pathologize belief, he dignified it. Jung inherited that sensibility. Viktor Frankl, too, draws straight from James' deepest current, the sacredness of choice under pressure. Frankl's logotherapy, which centers on meaning as a condition of psychological survival, is a continuation of James' insight that belief is not a luxury, it is a necessity. That even when evidence is incomplete, the act of believing can change what becomes real. Albert Einstein admired James, not for his physics, but for his moral vision, a universe not of cold necessity, but of participatory openness. James' pluralistic cosmos, still in formation, still open to our effort, resonated with Einstein's own sense of wonder and uncertainty. And then there are the unrecorded thinkers, the teachers, therapists, artists, spiritual seekers, reformers who lived out James' philosophy without ever naming it. They acted as if the world could be changed by belief, as if effort mattered, as if truth must prove itself in experience. And in doing so, they became his unwritten legacy. James did not leave behind a school. He left a style, a method, a challenge. To think with the whole self, to live as if ideas mattered, to honor experience as sacred ground. To follow the legacy of William James is to enter a river that branches endlessly, and each branch carries not a doctrine, but a possibility. James' influence cannot be traced by lineage. It must be felt in the way it reshapes the terrain of thought. He did not pass down answers. He passed down a temperament, restless, generous, unfinished. In the early 20th century, as logical positivism rose to dominate Western philosophy, James' pragmatism became a quiet resistance. Not a battle cry, but a steady whisper. Truth is not what you discover in abstraction, it's what you build through consequences. This whisper traveled across disciplines, across continents. It shaped the existentialists, even when they didn't know it. Søren Kierkegaard, who predated James, was posthumously linked by temperament, the insistence on the individual, the lived, the paradoxical. But it is through thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir that we see the existential urgency of James' magnified life as project, choice as burden, freedom as terror and gift. James had written, "We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, and never to be undone." Sartre echoed, "We are condemned to be free." In America, James' influence sparked a different flame. In the civil rights movement, echoes of his pluralism, his insistence that no one truth can silence another, resonated in the work of Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke not just of rights, but of conscience, of love as transformative force. James had declared, The world is still in the making. King believed it. He lived as if that were true. In education, Paulo Freire would later echo James in unexpected ways, challenging passive knowledge, insisting that learning is a dialogue, a co-creation. James, too, had warned against the authoritarianism of fixed truths. Freire made it political. And even today, in the swelling discourse around mental health, trauma, and meaning, James stands like a quiet ancestor. His work on the sick soul, on the struggle for moral energy, on the will to believe when nothing compels belief, these are not outdated reflections. They are alive in therapy rooms, in recovery programs, in the hearts of those trying to reclaim agency amid despair. He does not haunt the past. He infects the present. His influence is not in the repetition of his words. It is in the continuation of his courage. Now we arrive at the most subversive aspect of William James' legacy, his challenge to the very notion of final truth. Most philosophies, even the most progressive, still crave certainty. They offer systems, structures, clean geometries of thought, but James stood in defiance of that craving. He taught generations of thinkers that truth is not static, it is provisional, contextual, and human. In a pluralistic universe, James dismantles the dream of a single, coherent, all-explaining metaphysics. Instead, he offers a vision of the cosmos as unfinished, fractured, fertile. He invites us to consider that the world is more like a novel than a theorem open-ended, polyphonic, alive. This idea, radical in its time, has rippled through every discipline it touched. In theology, it gave rise to process thought, the idea that even the divine may evolve. In science, it encouraged models that accommodate uncertainty, complexity, emergence. In political philosophy, it inspired the defense of democratic pluralism not as a compromise, but as a metaphysical stance. What James did was reorient the philosopher's task. From system building to experience bearing. From pronouncement to participation. And so we must ask, what if the most ethical act is not to define the truth, but to make room for many truths to coexist, to contest, to converse? James leaves us no resting place. He wants us always in motion, always revising, always responding. This is not relativism. It is responsibility. If no truth is final, then every moment calls us to listen again, to choose again, to act with humility and resolve. This moral restlessness has shaped thinkers like Richard Rorty, who rejected the obsession with objectivity in favor of solidarity. Like Cornel West, who urges us to stay awake, stay human, stay unfinished. Like bell hooks, who calls us to radical love, not as theory, but as practice. James taught that to honor truth is to honor its plurality. And to do that, we must let go of our hunger for mastery. In the architecture of James' legacy, one room remains hidden from those who only read his work. It is the room of moral temperament. He did not believe that influence begins with brilliance. He believed it begins with how one bears the world. And this, more than his theories, shaped the generations that followed. James was not a philosopher of conquest. He was a philosopher of conscience. He understood that ideas do not move the world unless they pass through the furnace of lived character. And so he wrote in a voice that was uncertain, vulnerable, searching not to perform humility, but to practice it. And those who came after him learned that the courage to think is inseparable from the courage to feel. He once wrote, "The deepest thing in our nature is the desire to be appreciated, not flattered, not obeyed, appreciated, understood." This sensitivity to the moral dimension of thought would resonate deeply with thinkers across psychological and spiritual lines. James influenced Viktor Frankl not just in method, but in tone. Frankl's insistence that meaning is found not in ease, but in response to suffering, echoes James' belief that the will must be awakened in moments of despair. Both men believed that philosophy must be lived in extremity, not comfort. And in education, figures like Maria Montessori found in James a model of how to respect the soul of the learner, not to mold it, but to meet it. She, like James, treated attention as sacred, curiosity as moral, and choice as formative. This is the quieter part of James' legacy, the ethical style that permeates his pages, his refusal to dominate, his deep listening, his way of asking always, who is the person behind the idea? He taught us that influence is not control. It is contagion, that the soul moves not through power, but through contact. James' influence is often traced through citations and schools of thought, but its most powerful transmission may be found in the invisible shift he caused in the posture of modern intellect. He did not merely offer a new method. He offered a new way of standing in the world, neither above it, like the metaphysician, nor outside it, like the scientist, but within it, like the participant-witness. This orientation toward reality intimate, humble, experimental reverberates through countless disciplines today. In therapy, it shapes the clinician who listens without a script. In politics, it shapes the organizer who begins with dialogue, not ideology. In education, it shapes the teacher who creates space for thought to emerge, rather than imposing a conclusion. James' insistence on experience as the foundation of truth gave permission to a generation of thinkers to trust their lives, not to elevate subjectivity above all, but to restore it to dignity. He was not saying, believe anything. He was saying, believe with care, because your belief is a force. This view laid groundwork for feminist epistemology, which questioned who gets to define knowledge. Thinkers like Sandra Harding and Donna Haraway carry James' legacy when they ask, whose experience counts? Whose reality is made visible? It also shaped liberation theology and post-colonial theory frameworks that refused to let abstract systems erase lived suffering. James had written of the moral equivalent of war, a call for strenuous moral effort without destruction. That spirit echoes in every movement that combines inner transformation with social justice. His legacy is not reducible to influence. It is a current, a vibration in the way we now think, teach, believe, resist. It is in the small decisions to listen longer, to risk an idea, to admit what you don't know, to act while still unsure. James made those decisions visible. He made them meaningful. To grasp James' legacy fully, we must look not just at who he influenced, but at what he preserved. In an age rushing toward scientism, toward reductionism, toward control, James defended the uncertain, the plural, the human. He stood in the breach between dogma and despair and said, there is still room for belief, for freedom, for moral effort, and this more than any doctrine is what future generations learn from him, the courage to stay unfinished. James taught that experience is not a static fact, but a process of becoming. That reality is not a structure, but a field of possibilities. And that every act of choice, however small, participates in shaping the real. This insight has shaped entire fields, from narrative therapy to process theology, from experiential learning to participatory research. But more than that, it has shaped a style of being. It's the therapist who says, let's find meaning together. It's the educator who says, your story belongs here. It's the activist who says, what we do matters not in theory, but in the world we are co-creating. It's the artist who says, truth is not what I depict, but what I risk. James' influence does not prescribe, it awakens. And that awakening continues each time someone says, not I know, but I wonder. Not here is the answer, but here is a way. He reminds us that to inherit a legacy is not to repeat it, but to respond to it. Not to agree, but to continue the work. And so we ask, what would it mean for you to carry this legacy not by imitating it, but by risking your own thinking, your own voice, your own response to a world still being made? As we approach the heart of James' legacy, one truth becomes undeniable. His influence is not a line, it is a constellation. No single thinker continues his work. Rather, countless minds in different fields, at different times, carry pieces of his vision forward often, without knowing it. And this is how real influence works. Not by transmission, but by transformation. James seeded a new intellectual ecology, one in which doubt is not paralysis but inquiry, in which belief is not doctrine but courage, in which philosophy is not distant but lived. You feel this legacy in every thinker who dares to mix psychology with spirituality, science with ethics, activism with introspection. You feel it in those who reject the idea that we must choose between clarity and compassion, between rigor and imagination. Even artists and storytellers have inherited James' sensibility. The narrative arc of becoming of a self not discovered, but created through moral effort can be traced in novels, films, memoirs. Unaware characters wrestle with who they are becoming. James is there, whispering, "It matters what you choose," because that's what he gave us, not just ideas, but permission. Permission to be serious about experience. Permission to think without needing final answers. Permission to change, not because you are broken, but because you are still becoming. And perhaps the most radical permission of all, to trust that your thinking, your feeling, your choosing, however small, is part of the unfinished unfolding of the world. This is not just influence. This is invitation. James' legacy does not live in the past. It lives in every moment you stand at the edge of certainty and still choose to act. Now we come to the final movement, not an ending, but an opening. William James' legacy is not complete because it was never meant to be. He did not give us a closed system to protect. He gave us a flame to carry forward. His influence is not about agreement. It is about attention, not about replication, about response. What he taught above all is that the mind is a living thing, that thought is moral, that truth is unfinished, and that every one of us, whether philosopher or teacher, artist or activist, doubter or believer, stands in the middle of a world that is not yet what it could be. So we must choose not just what to think, but how to think. Not just what to believe, but how to live out that belief in action, in relation, in risk. James' real gift is not in the thinkers he influenced, but in the thinkers he awakens in us. He did not ask us to follow. He asked us to begin. To begin. Again. And again. And now one final question to carry with you. What kind of influence do you want to become, not by persuading, but by embodying the truth you're still discovering? If this video has stirred something in you, an idea, a memory, a moment of recognition, please like it, subscribe, and share it with 3 people who are ready to think more humanly, more openly, more courageously. Because the legacy isn't over. It's yours now.